Greetings. Welcome all. It's John Roars here at St. Andrew's Church for this Wednesday reflection. And as we've done the last few months, we're going to take on a different topic for these Wednesday videos this month of November. And this time we're going to focus on the theological tradition of the Episcopal Church, beginning today and then continuing through this month. And the place to start, I think, this is sort of a foundational orientation today. The place to start is with a concept you may have heard before or maybe not, called the via media, or the middle way. And this has long been sort of a foundational theological underpinning of the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Church, our origins in the Church of England. And the phrase is often attributed to a theologian named Richard Hooker, who was around in the 1550s, 60s, 70s, and he died in 1600. So he was really active at the time of the English Reformation and of course, the origins of the Anglican Church, where we trace our history. And he coined that phrase, the via media, and it was a reflection of how to balance the Catholic tradition, that of course was the only faith tradition, church tradition that people knew, with the Reformed theology that was emerging so powerfully at that time, and how to in the decades and even centuries that followed, of course, there was great conflict and often violent conflict between these two sides, and a struggle for power and control of the church in that place, and you know, power and conflict and struggle that continues in some places today. So his concern was how to bridge those divides in what would become a new church, the Anglican Church, that really carried forth elements of both, elements of that Catholic tradition, some elements of the hierarchy, some elements of the Catholic theology and liturgy that are still familiar today, and yet incorporated a lot of that Reformed teaching and theology and practice as well, and really created this new structure. So his great contribution was this theological underpinning of the middle way, And I want to start by reading a collect. As it happens, today, November 3rd, I'm recording this on Tuesday, is Richard Hooker's feast day. And I was going to talk about him anyway. I didn't even realize it was his feast day. So all the more appropriate. And perhaps especially appropriate on this election day, too, when we're feeling such a sense of conflict and division and divisiveness, that we would think about this middle way, this via media, as a good perspective for today. So Richard Hooker, the prayer for him in our book of saints, Holy Women, Holy Men, goes like this. O God of truth and peace, you raised up your servant Richard Hooker in a day of bitter controversy to defend with sound reasoning and great charity the Catholic and Reformed religion. Grant that we may maintain that middle way, not as a compromise for the sake of peace, but as a comprehension for the sake of truth. I love that collect. It's beautifully crafted, and especially that bit about not simply as a compromise for the sake of peace, but as a comprehension for the sake of truth. And that's how I think about the Episcopal Church and our theology. Is sometimes you hear people accuse Episcopalians of being wishy-washy, or we want to kind of anything goes, or believe what we will, or whatever, and in the sense of like kind of a compromise between different perspectives. But I see it quite like that comprehension for the sake of truth. We Episcopalians are committed to the core doctrines of faith. The story of creation and our salvation, the story of Jesus Christ and his liberation and redemption of us and of the world, and these core doctrines form the basis of our faith. But we also, at the same time, embrace a sense of mystery and wonder, and we know that we don't have all the answers, and we understand that the journey of faith is just that. It's a journey, hopefully ever drawing ever nearer into God's presence and growing in that trust and that faith and that wisdom and trusting in the mercy of God and being comfortable with a little bit of uncertainty and ambiguity in the midst of that journey, I think is a beautiful thing. So going back to Hooker and this foundation of the Via Media, let me share why that was so important. During the years of the Reformation, so all of a sudden you have many different facets of a conflict between Reformed theology and practice and the Catholic tradition. So that played out in the meaning and doctrine of the Eucharist was one of the key places, and what people meant and thought about the bread and the wine. Did it become Christ's body and blood in a real sense, or was it just a symbol, an act of remembrance, but didn't really change its state in that sense? And so those were the Catholic and Reformed poles. And again, the Church of England, the Anglican Church, our Episcopal tradition finds a middle ground between the two. And I talked about that a few videos ago. Another place was some of the Reformed churches were very adamant about the primacy of Scripture, and that Scripture was the kind of sola scriptura. That was the path of the Christian life and the path of salvation, versus an emphasis on the works of mercy and kind of the actions and behaviors of your life and acts of charity and mercy and justice, sort of working out your salvation in that sense and in cooperation with God. And so there was this pull there, and there again, the Anglican tradition, Episcopal tradition teaches that both are important. Certainly Scripture is how we learn and engage the story of our salvation, and that's sort of the framework for our Christian life. But we have to live that out in order to fully be present to the gift of grace that God is ever bestowing upon us. We need to live that out in love of neighbor and love of God and love of ourselves. Another example is our prayer book that we became over time known as sort of people of the book and people of prayer, and that becomes the source of our unity, and also in some ways there's a book that we all had to read in seminary called Praying Shapes Believing. So it's sort of out of our prayer guides our practices and habits of belief and our habits of faith, rather than some traditions, have edicts from on high, and that governs your faith, or some have a book of discipline or a book of confession, and you have to agree to certain doctrinal statements, and we don't really have either of those poles in the Episcopal Church. What we have is this common prayer. And that's where we find our connection and our unity and our the kind of strength and ties that bind us. So these are all many examples of that via media in practice, that middle way that the Anglican and Episcopal Church has found between these different traditions. Another example is even how we interpret Scripture. You may have heard the metaphor of a three-legged stool. So the way in which we interpret Scripture is balanced on these three legs. It's the witness of Scripture itself, the stories of Scripture as we receive them and interpret them. Another is the tradition, the church's history of interpretation of those Scripture, and the church's teaching over time that changes over time as new understandings unfold. And then the third leg is our human reason and our experience, which again changes and evolves over time. And we see that in how we learn to read the Scripture differently and learn about the passages around slavery, or about the role of women in society and the church, or the role of LGBTQ people in our communities and in their place in our church. And so, are in lots of ways that our understanding, our human understanding and experience changes over time. So our interpretation of Scripture, it really balances those three, and that becomes a more nuanced and, again, comprehensive approach to our interpretation of Scripture. So all of these form that concept of that via media, which again I think is a beautiful starting place to understand the practice and the ethos of the Episcopal Church. Again, we are a big tent in that sense, and it's no wonder that I think I read one time that 70% of Episcopalians came from other denominational traditions. It often happens when people get married, or a couple, and they come to us, and one is Catholic and one was Presbyterian or whatever, and they both find a home in the Episcopal Church, because we have that embrace of comprehension and an embrace of different perspectives as we seek to kind of hold on to those core doctrines, but allow ourselves room to learn and to grow in faith, and to share with one another, and to share in the mystery and wonder of God and God's presence and place in our world. So those are some thoughts on this election day and this feast day of Richard Hooker. And this day, as we kick off some reflections on the theology of the Episcopal Church. So tune in again next week for more, and thanks for joining us today.